Joining us today is Dr. Alan Amtzis, a former program director at the College of New Jersey with a passion in media literacy and narrative construction. That is a very, very heavy lift of a title. I love it. Very distinguished. Thank you, Alan, for joining us.
So let me deconstruct that heavy introduction a little bit. I grew up at the movies. I saw my first movie when I was 5 years old, and the love affair has never stopped. I grew up and all I wanted to do was work in the movies. And because I grew up in New York City in the 70s, I had the opportunity to see hundreds of movies a year, and I did. I eventually went to Columbia University and got a master's in film studies and then worked in the film business. I was a script analyst and a casting director. And most of my friends in my 20s and 30s were screenwriters. So I got to know a lot about how scripts are constructed. In particular, how do you plant things in the beginning so that they'll pay off later without the audience knowing you're actually manipulating them a little bit? Then somewhere in my 30s, I took a break from working in the film business and became a high school teacher, and then got my doctorate and worked at the College of New Jersey as a program director, teaching classes in reflective practice and creativity development for teachers. But about 10 years ago, I reclaimed my film identity and developed a series of courses on the history of LGBTQ films, which is probably the best job I've ever had. It was a hugely successful course if you judge it by the way my 18 and 19-year-old LGBTQ identified students reacted to the course. So that's the sort of human level version of the introduction you made. So I am passionate about films as a gay man. I'm also particularly intrigued by how gayness, or now queerness, is represented on the screen, big and small.
Fascinating walk through your life. I have one follow-up. I mean, I always have many follow-up questions, but my one question to you is, do you remember the movie that inspired your love affair of movies when you were 5?
The very first movie I ever saw in a movie theater at 5 was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And when I tell people that my first movie was Psycho, usually the first question they ask is, oh my God, are you afraid of showers? And I'm not afraid of showers, but I am terrified of motels. I will not spend a night in a motel. And I do want to add, probably the second most important movie in my life is a movie I saw when I was 15 in 1970, a British film that was nominated for 4 Oscars called Women in Love, based on the D.H. Lawrence novel. And the reason it's important is it is because of that movie that I understood what my sexuality was. And I was able to come out at age 15 because I saw a movie that explored the parameters and the limits of male sexuality, at least in England in 1920s anyway.
That's a really beautiful and powerful story, because I think a thread that we've carried throughout these episodes of this podcast is just how important representation and seeing yourself portrayed is for feeling humanized, and also for like your coming out story, or part of your understanding of yourself.
Yeah. And the representation piece is hugely important. A few years back when Crazy Rich Asians opened widely, and it's ostensibly a comedy. I mean, there are some serious parts of it, but it's mostly a comedy. Awkwafina, who was in the movie, in an interview talked about how many Asians were moved to tears by this comedy. And when she was asked to explain that, she said, you have no idea how important representation is until you realize you haven't had it. And I think that Heated Rivalry is a major stride forward in several categories on that front.
Alan, before we get too deep into representation, we would love to ask your origin story. So how did you come across the show? And tell us everything about that.
It's a little strange because as recent as that origin is, I'm not completely clear on why it took me so long to get there. But I think you might be part of it. So X number of weeks or months ago, I have a good friend at work who's also gay, and we often meet every week to talk about what have you seen this week and what have you done this week. And he recommended Heated Rivalry to me, and he said it was about hockey players and blah, blah, blah. And somehow it just did not register. It just went in one ear and out the other. And then jump cut a couple of weeks, maybe even months later, and he asked me again. And I said, oh my God, I totally forgot, but I will get to it. I will get to it. And it was the same week they heard about your podcast. And I thought, okay, there's just too much swirling around this. So let me sit down with this. I watched all 6 episodes within a week. It wasn't a complete binge, like a whole weekend. It took a full week. But I think it's because I constantly was hitting the back arrow so I could see that scene again and that scene again. And it was like being freed from prison. Despite all the tension and the questions and issues, there's something incredibly healthy and freeing in this series that I think people are responding to. It was like, where has this been my entire life as a gay man? And it's tricky because they're closeted, which politically should be a problem, but it's not for me. There's always been an underexplored tension since the 70s when it was called gay liberation and then just gay rights and now queer rights about what does queer activism do for LGBTQ people, specifically in terms of self-identity. So there are those who think everyone should come out. And then there are those who say it's not about coming out, it's about the right to privacy. And there's a really shifting sand there. Ideally, I wish we lived in a world where everyone could come out. But we cannot yet advocate that everyone come out because it's dangerous for some people, including Ilya and Shane, who stand to maybe lose their entire career. And then you have to, of course, figure Scott into the mix, who does come out. So it really hits all the targets.
Can I go back to something you said about what the show meant to you and as part of your origin story? You said, where has this been my whole life? And you feel like it was, escaping from prison. You have this sort of this eagle-eyed view of media, specifically queer media. What was it about this show that made you say those things and feel those things?
It's a difficult sensibility to define. I think it's because Shane and Ilya get together so quickly and so easily. And although Shane goes through a little bit of mental change and challenge, it's not a torturous story, even though occasionally he is uncertain about how he feels. Ilya certainly is not. And so there is a kind of embrace very quickly about who they are, what they feel, what they want from each other, and what they're going to do that we then see. I think it might be just about the most visually explicit depiction of gay sex I've seen on television. And so that's also part of it. And I just think there's a very difficult to define atmosphere in the room of release and joy in them finding each other.
I think it's interesting that you mention how the two of them are different in terms of their acceptance. And we haven't really discussed this before, but you are so right. Ilya's pretty self-assured. He knows that he's bi, even he's pretty secure with that. And I wonder if it's because he's already had experience with another man when he was younger, whereas Shane obviously never has. Like, he's never even thought he was attracted to men until he met Ilya. What you're saying reminded me of episode 4, where Ilya's trying very unsuccessfully to like prod Jane, like, I like girls. Do you like girls? And Shane's like, yeah, of course I like girls, like not realizing at all that he actually does not. I do think it's a very important part that one of them is pretty secure in his sexuality, even though he's obviously not coming out. And one of them is completely rejecting everything he feels for a very long time. But I do want to go back to representation because you are here to speak about representation in queer media and how Heated Rivalry kind of changes the game. So please, we want to hear everything you have to say.
Can we start with the timeline for us newbies? That would be great.
Sure.
Yes.
So in terms of timeline, I mean, depictions of lesbian and gay men go back at least 100 years, depending on how seriously you want to take the depiction. There's a wonderful movie that I would recommend to anyone hearing this called The Celluloid Closet, and it covers the first 100 years of the movies, basically the 20th century, about how LGBTQ, well, not even LGBT, they were just gay or lesbian, because there was no TQ yet, but how they were either objects of ridicule or perversions of nature who were to be feared. And that persisted for a very long time, decades from old Hollywood. There was even a ban against it in the 20s when they instituted the moral decency code. And one of the things that could not be shown or could not be shown in a positive way was sexual deviance. So that included lesbian and gay characters. Some of that seeped in from foreign films, particularly Germany. but nothing was very healthy until maybe the 50s. And even then, the homosexual had to pay a price, usually suicide or death. There had to be a moral ending that somehow eradicated their sexuality. What's really interesting is that in the broader media, things started to change in publishing in the 50s. There was a wonderful series of lesbian pulp fiction novels from the 50s by Anne Bannon, and I don't know if that's her real name, or someone named Vince Packard, which is definitely not a real name. It's M.E. Kerr, who is also a children's book author. They wrote a series of lesbian pulp fiction novels, which sort of broke through the curse of the movies and established a couple of tropes that we still have to this day. In particular, in any lesbian relationship, there had to be one dark-haired one and one blonde and fair one. Had to be a contrast. And usually the dark-haired one was the aggressive, more butch one, and the blonde one was a little bit more faux innocent. That still persists to this day. If you look at a lot of film and series, Brokeback Mountain, which is, I think, the sort of filmic immediate predecessor to Heated Rivalry. But the color roles are reversed. In Heated Rivalry, the blonde is the more aggressive. So we start to see in 50s and 60s things changing so that the gay characters don't have to die at the end, can be a bit more fulfilling, self-respecting. And of course, right now, like the last 15 years, probably since Brokeback Mountain in 2005, the proliferation of LGBTQ positive imagery, especially in television, is outrageous. One of the things I learned from teaching my LGBTQ film course to undergraduates, my 18 and 19-year-old students had access to Heartstoppers and Young Royals and Red, White, and Royal Blue and Dead Boy Detectives and First Kill, just an unprecedented flood of delightful, young gay characters who are not tormented and guilt-ridden by their sexuality. And Heated Rivalry is probably the most sophisticated one to surf in on that wave.
I do remember when Brokeback Mountain came out. Do you remember so much like ridicule being thrown at Jake and Heath for playing these characters? I specifically remember like a reporter, and I don't remember the exact wording, a reporter asking like this overtly homophobic question, and Heath being so graceful in his response of it. They said Jack was a sexual predator. It was so deeply tragic, right? But the response to that versus the response to Ilya and Shane and the actors, Hudson and Connor, is just so remarkably different.
I do remember Heath Ledger saying something about, why does everyone keep asking me, how did it feel to play a gay cowboy? I recently played a heroin-addicted prostitute, and nobody had any trouble accepting that. But both the actors in Heated Rivalry are having one hell of a career positive year. Nobody is giving them flack for how scary was it to play a gay character. They don't seem to think it was scary at all. If we're going to talk about identity construction and narrative construction, I'd like to focus a little bit on how Shane and Ilya are constructed not only as sexual beings and as gay or bi or somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, but also as athletes. So something that Jacob Tierney had to think about is, how are we building the character of Ilya and Shane in terms of how many games they win against each other? I bet if we tallied up, they're pretty neck and neck. And also the sexual politics of it. I mean, Ilya is constructed as more the top, the more masculine, the more dominant. And Shane is constructed, although he's aggressive, so we hear on the ice, he's very passive in bed. And if we go with the long-standing and more traditional descriptors, a little more feminized. But this show really shows us how fluid those terms really are, how limiting they are. There's a wonderful drag queen named Sasha Velour, who was the winner of season 9 on RuPaul's Drag Race. Sasha has a master's degree in gender studies and performance art and brings a gender consciousness to drag that I don't hear out anywhere else. And in one of their shows, they paused and almost as an aside said, why is femininity something we only allow women to have? And I just thought, wow, why have we constructed femininity as second in the hierarchy of sexual activity, especially in the gay world. So I think a lot during the series about what actions, what lines of dialogue are attributed to the two characters and what escapades on the ice are given to them. And I had a conversation with one of your prior guests, Dr. Tabitha Delangelo, who's a good friend of mine, about Shane as an aggressive monster on the ice, but really wants to be penetrated, literally, by his rival in bed. And we came to the conclusion that both things can coexist, that it's not even a contradiction. And I think that's one of the strengths and values of the show. Without being didactic, we get to see what this fluidity looks like in the lives of two very good-looking young men. There's a lot of consciousness from the original author to Jacob Tierney to the two actors about how we're going to present them as complex, whole, gay sports figures. And I'd love to know what you think about that.
You had so many interesting nesting dolls in that segment. I wanted to kind of come back to what you said about what they looked like, and in so many ways, both of them were sort of paragons of what you would say masculinity should look like physically. And there are other characters in this universe that are not that way at all. So to me, actually, they are both incredibly masculine in that way that is has mass appeal. You could say Ilya is clearly a favorite of Rachel Reed, the author. So you could say, obviously, it makes sense to start there. But you have to think about the narrative construction. You want to pick something that appeals to everyone. So they're traditionally masculine, maybe in a very masculine sport. The thing that the show does is, as you said, kind of flip those tropes when Shane says he wants to be the whole rather than the peg. Even I think the way the actors have carried themselves through this is very sort of fluid between this masculine feminine construct. Everyone's admiring them for it.
The scene where Shane says to Rose, I guess I'm more of a square peg in a round hole, although I'm more comfortable being the round hole. I actually thought, Shane really say that? That was just a little less delicate than I'd heard Shane talk. But Rose is the first person he comes out to. And I want to backtrack a tiny half step to a conversation in bed with Ilya and Shane where Shane confesses that he has a thing. And I honestly had no idea what he meant. And thank God Ilya did. And I thought, okay, you didn't know you were gay, but you have a thing. Okay, that's a little weird, but okay. But I really want to go back to the first part of the first episode and how they actually get together. There's that wonderfully sensual, fingers on the cup thing, and then there's the checking each other out bicycling thing. But really it starts when Ilya looks at Shane's nudity in the shower and his eyebrows go boing. And Shane catches and goes, fuck you, Rosanov. But it's too late. The floodgate has now been opened. My question about all that is, with all the hot hockey players around them, how does Ilya know Shane's the right one to approach? I don't have an answer for that.
Well, I think it was because of the water bottle, because he was very clearly feeling him out, passing the water bottle, and probably noticed the fact that Shane was staring at his crotch and his neck the entire time. So I would assume that is probably how Ilya was testing him to see if he's interested or not.
It's like a whole thing in the Game Changer world about Ilya's gaydar, that it's pretty spot on. But I also think that him being Russian born and being in a place where he has to be so careful about who and what he tells, he's developed this maybe since he was a child. So I wonder if that played into it. Understanding the subtext is something that Ilya can do both because of where he grew up and how he grew up.
There's also, I may be about to cross a cultural boundary with you, Diana, but there is something in the history of Russian literature about being in two mind spaces at once. There is a sort of schism that works beautifully in literature. In Dr. Zhivago, in the early scene where his mother is being buried, young Yuri Zhivago is not only watching his mother's funeral, but imagining being inside the coffin with her. And this sort of splitting of perspective, certainly in Crime and Punishment, the character is occupying more than one space. But I wonder if there is a little bit of that in the Russian consciousness that Ilya is bearing. And he's smart enough to know it. I mean, Ilya's pretty self-aware, I think. You can probably tell I'm just the tiniest little bit in love with Ilya.
Gosh, who isn't?
I might be the only slightly on Shane side of things. I love Ilya though.
Yeah.
But I'm much more 50-50 than Diana.
That's because you're neurodivergent. You have a kinship. That you have a kinship with Shane. I saw a thread actually about Russian Soviet trauma specifically. It was a great analysis. I think when you're growing up in a place that takes away your bodily autonomy and really any decisions that you can ever make for yourself in any way, shape, or form, you become very observant and intuitive as to what you can and cannot do in public. And what you can and cannot say in public, and what you can and cannot think. Even your thoughts are always translated to your expressions, right? This is like the Orwell, Big Brother is watching you, but, there's also thought police that you can't even look at someone a certain way because people will know and infer. So when you have someone like Ilya who's growing up in such an environment, this is one of the reasons he becomes or is so observant and intuitive with everything that's going on around him. He notices people's mental health struggles throughout the universe. He notices people's relationships and friendships and how they affect each other. Like, he's an observant person.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes him such a dynamic character as well.
So did we answer your question of sort of the narrative of masculine, feminine?
Yes, it was about that. And again, once we start talking about them, I feel like these forces are so falsely polarized. But how those work to construct Ilya and Shane's identity throughout the entire range of their activities, which aren't just having sex with each other in bed, but also facing each other on the ice. And you have to admit, it's one of the great narrative tensions of Forever that they hate each other on the ice and they're sexually compatible in bed. There is something there for them to feel they have to defend and protect.
Enemies to lovers, or not actually enemies to lovers, which is also a trope. Heated Rivalry has those delightful tropes that I love about romance. It delves deep in a way that connects you, but it still maintains the delight of why do we like those types of things?
A long existing problematized issue in LGBTQ media, which is the fact that gay identity is traditionally defined through your sexual activity. And we don't do that quite so much anymore, thank God, for queer youth who have really been successful in throwing off a lot of the stereotypical terms. I mean, when I was teaching my LGBTQ course, and I tried to really cover lots of bases, films about lesbians made by women, films about lesbians made by men, films about bisexual people. And I had a student ask me, how come we're not seeing any films about aces, asexuals? I hadn't even heard the term yet. So I was like, well, first you have to tell me what that is. So note to self. And then I said, I don't know of any movies about aces because it's tricky to get inside the psychology of someone who is being defined by not having sex. And if there's a gay movie and they're not having sex, people are going to be, wait a minute, how are they gay? So it's the fact that sexuality is defined by what you do in a bed or a bedroom or some other parallel place. And although there's plenty of sex and sexuality in Heated Rivalry, it somehow is so, I can't think of another word other than healthy, that it somehow blows apart the problematization, I think. And maybe that's one of the reasons I love it so much. The both of them are pretty stable for the most part. Two other things I want to mention in terms of identity and construction, because they function as narratively necessary. Most of the women in Shane and Ilya's lives are incredibly supportive, loving presences. Rose certainly helps Shane come out. Ilya's good friend Svetlana, who I love her line when she says, I hope Jane knows how lucky he is. She's pretty hip to what's going on. Kip's good friend, Elena, she's incredibly supportive. And even Shane's mother. Shane's mother is wonderfully supportive, which she should be. But I was very surprised there wasn't a moment where she said, do you know what this is going to do to your Rolex deal? I love the fact that even though Shane's mother is supportive, as Shane needs her to be narratively, I was surprised that she didn't even have a moment of conflict about potentially losing all this lucrative sponsorship that is paid for his cottage.
We talked about this very particular thing like a week or so ago about Shane's mother, and I agreed with you when we were speaking. But think about the fact that, like, all she has done his entire life is give him everything he needed, she thought, right? Like, she was managing his career and making sure that he's happy and healthy. And, he even had her name written on his hockey stick. She is a very, very supportive parent in every way possible. And when she realizes that this crucial part of Shane's identity he has kept hidden because she somehow made it impossible for him to come to her, I think that, just getting into the mom psyche of it all, I don't know if at that point it would have been realistic for her to be like, no, 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 what about the brand deals? I think at that moment she realized that she failed in such a crucial way as a mom who thought like she has the best interests of her kid at heart. And here she is failing at the most significant part of his life that he has kept a 10-year relationship. He was literally in love, right? Like
Yeah.
that was the only person that was probably the closest to him in a very intimate way. When she realized that she failed in that way, like, I think her apology was the most realistic part in that moment. What are your thoughts about that?
You have convinced me. I think you're absolutely right. No, really, it does make sense that it's a moment of realization for her that she has eclipsed looking at her son 360, and she
Yeah.
apologized for it. It makes narrative sense.
There's one thing in that scene that I still think stays true to Yuna's character, which is that she's like, you're going to quit Boston. She's not yet convinced that Ilya and Shane thing is going to work out because, it's like 5 seconds old to her. But she's telling Ilya, what, you're going to quit Boston. You have no sense of loyalty. And I think that kind of hooks her back into her like personality. But
Yeah.
I agree. I think it would have been a misstep if she came back and said, like, what about the brand deals?
That whole scene after the discovery where they're having dinner and it's, thanks for the pasta. It's just, it's such a beautifully healthy scene. I have absolutely no idea where season 2 could possibly go. Once they're out, is there a story? Like, hi, now we're out and we're going to change hockey. We're going to change the world. Good luck. I hope so. That would be nice. But I actually cannot even imagine what season 2, episode 1 is going to be. I can't wait to see it, but I have absolutely no idea.
We know because we read this follow-up book.
Yeah, but we're going to tell you nothing. We're going to tell you nothing,
nothing.
Alan. Can I ask you a question on what you just said? You
Of
said,
course.
are they going to change the hockey world? In the narrative arc of this story, does that fit? Would it be narratively cohesive to say, oh, now Shane and Ilya in season 2 are going to now like be some sort of spokespeople for
I
the
don't
queer
know.
hockey community?
I don't know, because one of the things I did in preparation for this discussion was I Googled who are the gay hockey players, who are the gay football players, who are the gay baseball players, who are the gay rugby players. And I noticed the more aggressively violent the sport, the fewer number of out players there are. There really is still a problem with being masculine and gay. Going way back to the very beginning of our conversation, another autobiographical nugget. I grew up in a hockey family, mother, father, and 2 sisters, all of whom loved hockey. I was the only boy child and the only gay one in the family. And my father, maybe in an attempt to include me in something masculine, often took me to hockey games at Madison Square Gardens because he could see the New York Rangers. My only interest in the game was seeing the players come out on the ice because I wanted to see what they looked like. I spent most of the game running up and down the aisles talking to people about who was their favorite player. And my father was, of course, a bit dismayed, I think, that I wasn't like watching the game and cheering on the team.
No, I understand you because I am that is also my interest in hockey.
On the other hand, I'm watching the playoffs with like bated breath, actually.
I'm kidding. I actually do weirdly enjoy hockey. But Alan, it's interesting that you mentioned that because when Heated Rivalry first came out, I saw an article that said there's absolutely not a single out player in professional sports right now at this moment. And like that's impossible that they are all straight.
No,
Statistically
they're not all
improbable.
great.
Right.
That is impossible, but it is very possible they don't feel they can come out.
Oh, of course. Right. Alan, if you were, though, create a narrative for season 2, what do you think that would look like?
Gee, that is
I
a
love
good
that.
question, and I wish I had a ready-made answer. Inspired by Scott Hunter, there is an opening for them to come out, but Scott Hunter was not having a sexual relationship with his literal rival.
Mhm.
I mean, sports analysts love rivalries. So what happens to hockey? What happens to their life when or if Shane and Ilya come out as lovers? What happens to their fans? So you've asked me to project. Does Ilya move to the Ottawa team? Do they open a charity together? I mean, why not a muffin store in Provincetown, for goodness sake? I don't know. I don't.
What
I
would you
don't
like
know.
to see then? If you had your like ideal narrative.
I would like them to enter a throuple relationship with a retired academic professor.
I think that is the best answer. That is the best thing any of my gay boyfriends have said to me. I wish that for them and you as well. Alan, I think I'd love to end this episode by asking what your favorite scene and or episode and why.
I'm willing to bet that my favorite scene is probably the number one response you get. I'm just guessing. It's Ilya's monologue in Russian on the phone to Shane. It's so beautiful because there's so much communication without Shane understanding a word. And it's Ilya at his most vulnerable, and it's Shane at his most open. It's the Venn diagram of most connection. And I just think it's beautiful.
It's interesting that you say Ilya is the most vulnerable and Shane is the most open because while Ilya is very vulnerable, I think he's covered because he knows Shane doesn't understand what he's saying, right? So like he's allowed himself to say everything he feels deeply in his mother tongue so he could actually say it all the
Yeah.
way he wants to say it all. But it's also slightly cowardly because he knows Shane won't understand it. And he knows that Shane has been basically begging him to share like how he feels about his family and everything. You know, he's like, you could always talk to me, Ilya. I think Shane is just very also intuitive in that moment. And you know, knowing that what Ilya needs and he's giving him what he needs. Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. It was truly a pleasure. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation and you bring so much expertise to this topic and we've really enjoyed having you on. So thank you.
Well,
Thank
I
you
am
so much.
honored to be included. I really am. It's such a treat to talk about this work in particular, but also just gay media with such a fun, intelligent set of hosts. So
Thank
I
you,
really am
Alan.
honored to be included. Thank you.